Welcome to the Secrets of College Planning. I'm your host, Anthony Uva, and today we're going to get some insight on how colleges recruit for wrestling. My guest today is Gary Taylor. He's the head men's wrestling coach at Rider University, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, no problem. So usually I start my guests where they went to college. So where did you go to school?
I went to two colleges. Went to Clarion first, and that's where I wrestled and all of that. And then I finished up at East Stroudsburg. We moved there. My wife took a job teaching up there. So I assisted Clyde, Red Whitman at that time at East Stroudsburg. They had very strong, actually a national program. It was probably the best time that they had in all of wrestling. He was an excellent coach and an excellent guy to be under as a mentor and so on.
Great. So now let's go a little back before college. When did you start thinking about college? Is it freshman year, sophomore year of high school? And when did you start thinking about wrestling in college?
Well, I wrestled varsity all 4 years, so recruiting was slightly different than in that much of that didn't happen till the end. But I wrestled on a very strong team in the state of Pennsylvania and had watched other fellow wrestlers, wrestle and then move on to college. So yeah, you're thinking about it at different times. You're, again, the recruiting process today happens much earlier than it did at that time. So
Sure.
It's kind of in the back of your mind, and you watch people that you wrestled on teams with move on to college and so on. So you're asking them questions, how it works and all of that.
Great.
And then.
And how did you pick Clarion as the school?
Well, Bob and Neil Turner were the coaches. They're both now in the National Hall of Fame. Clarion was at that time building a major powerhouse to the point of where they had 3 of the 10 national champs in 1 year. So it was a very, very strong, as most of the state system was, and still is. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's an awful lot of wrestlers, and the PA state schools. Clarion was actually just really coming up at that time, and then they really took off after that.
Gotcha. So now, after college, how does one become the head men's wrestling coach at Rider University? What was the process that you took from graduating from college to today?
Well, as I said, I didn't wrestle under Red Whitman, but I coached with him and assisted him at East Stroudsburg. And through that process, about the time that I was finishing up with him, he had mentioned, I just got something that came across my desk that Rider University, or Rider College at that time, now Rider University, he said, would you be interested? I said, tell me a little bit more, about it, because I wasn't as familiar with it at that time. And as he talked more and more, I was already applying for high school positions and so on, and this was an opportunity at the collegiate level, which I preferred. And I knew I preferred that at that time. I knew that all through college, in watching both Bob, Neil Turner, excellent mentors as well. I was fortunate to be under some very good men and coaches, and I watched them, and I thought, you know what, I really like that. And then spending time with Red Whitman, I thought I'd really like to do that one day, not thinking that it would happen as a first job. So
that was your first job right after assisting at East Stroudsburg. That Rider University was the very first position you had.
Rider was the very first position I had. There was a 2-year period that I wrestled for a team called Athletes in Action right out of college. When I wrestled for Athletes in Action, my teammates and coaches were John Peterson, Olympic gold medalist, and Gene Davis, Olympic bronze medalist. And being around them and being on that team, we were in every major wrestling room in the country, and we trained there and so on. So I got a chance to, again, I was very fortunate to be around good coaches all my life, my high school coaches in the Pennsylvania State Hall of Fame. So in those 2 years, I knew that at the end of that second year that I wanted to, start a career. And that's when I went back up to Stroudsburg and talked to Red Whitman. He said, and it wasn't a thing where I was asking him. He just happened to mention, by the way, Gary, would you be interested in this? And I said, well, I'd like to hear more about it. He told me more about it. And he said, well, and I said, yeah, I really want to apply. Now, I was already applying and had already been offered a job at a high school level. And I thought, well, I'm going to apply here and just see. And when I went to that interview, I shared with them, that I have to make a decision. I don't know what your time process, but I have to make a decision because they have a contract and they've offered it to me.
Wow.
So I said by a couple weeks, I've got to decide this. So Ryder came back and offered me the job, and I mean, it was a no-brainer at that time for me, just because I knew I liked the collegiate level. I had been around that for quite a bit at that time, both at Stroudsburg and then with Athletes in Action.
Gotcha. So now you're at the school. You've been there 36 years?
37, I believe.
37 this year. Wow.
Yeah.
So 37 years. Give our audience a little bit of background on the team itself, because it's been quite a ride for yourself.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is a situation that I walked into after coming off of Athletes in Action and being every major program in the United States. So when I first got to Ryder, a fellow named Barry Burtnett had started the program, did a great job of building a good foundation at that point in time. So when I got there and I accepted the job, they did an interview, at the beginning, and they said, well, what do you want to see happen here? And I said, well, my goal is to bring Eastern and national recognition to Ryder University. And you could have heard a pin drop at that because at that time they had never had a nationally ranked wrestler, they'd never had a nationally ranked team, and they had never obviously had an All-American. So they said, well, that's pretty lofty. I said, well, you asked me, that's what's going to happen. And in my opinion, to me, it wasn't even a goal. It was going to happen.
Wow.
It was just, that's how I thought, that's how I coached. And, it's a goal, but to me, it was a realistic goal, but to everyone else, it was not a realistic goal at that time. And by our second year, we placed 18th in the nation. We had our first All-American.
Wow.
So fortunately, Barry had, left. When he left, he did a really good job of recruiting. My first All-American was Lou DiSerafino, and Lou went from not winning a conference to placing third in the nation. And I knew at the time that I watched Lou for a while, because again, I had been around the best of the best. Right. There's no doubt in my mind when I watched Lou that he could be that. And I told him that. And he laughed at me and I didn't talk to him. And he kept coming back in the office. I told him I wouldn't talk to him. And, he said, he came in one day, apologized and said, I thought you were just trying to, build me up so that I could win the conference. I said, you have to win the conference to go to nationals. That's the byproduct. I'm looking at the national level and I'm telling you, you're good enough to do it. And so that process was the first one. You had to spend an awful lot of time, individual time with Lou to get him there, but it wasn't just the technique and so on. It was more the mental aspect to get him to believe at that level, get his technique better so that his confidence kept building. And then, we could follow that up with 14 All-Americans over those 30-some years.
So what are some of the qualities, and when does a high school student start to think about going to college for wrestling? What are the qualities that they need, and when do they start thinking about it? Is this freshman or sophomore year, or is it senior year?
It is today. It is today. If you'd asked me
freshman year?
15 years ago, I would have had a different answer. But today, your freshman, sophomore year, you're already being looked at.
Wow.
And you're being looked at pretty seriously if you're
And what
having
are
a lot of success.
qualities that they need for wrestling?
The perfect scenario is always going to be the total student athlete. Someone that is a serious academic student and someone who also has the potential to wrestle in Division I. And there's a distinction there. I mean, it's you know, you're clearly today with 77 or 78 programs, and
That's just Division I
hundreds
programs.
of thousands of wrestlers throughout the nation. You're getting an opportunity that not many people get. So you have to be at a certain level, or certainly you have to have, you know, there has to be something there that a Division I coach is seeing potentially that you could get there.
And so what are some of those qualities that they're looking for?
First and foremost, as a student,
So grades.
that makes your job much easier if the grades are good, okay?
Sure.
Because you know they're taking it pretty serious in high school, they'll take it usually pretty serious in college. You're going to run into situations where kids are extremely talented, but they are not as strong a student in high school because they didn't understand how important it is. So if you're going to take one of those student athletes, and you have a job ahead of you filling in the gaps of why it was important and why you missed that in high school, but you won't miss it in college, or you won't be in college. So it's that simple. That's the kind of conversations that you have to have. But ideally, you do have some pretty good choices today, because a lot of those kids want to be in Division I. So a lot of them do have, you know, very good grades coming out. Work ethic is probably more important in college by far than high school. You don't have to have the greatest work ethic in high school. If you're good, you're just better than people. It just happens that way.
How about weights? Is there weight mean a lot at the high school level? Because I know there's heavyweight, and then there's a lot of different weight classes in wrestling.
Yeah, to go back to that other point before I move on to weight, you look for work ethic, because everybody's good at Division I college. If you don't have the work ethic, you're going to have a hard time transitioning at the conference and at the national level. So that's one of the biggest things that I look for. Mm-hmm. Weight classes are tricky. They're very tricky because I'll give you an example. We had a two-time All-American named John Carvalera. Coming out of high school, he won a high school national championship at 103 pounds. He's a senior, okay? So a lot of big colleges liked him, but they didn't know if he was going to be big enough for 125. Mm-hmm. I looked at him, and I looked that there was some range there as well. And I was sitting in a situation with two lightweights that were very good, so I knew John didn't have to go in right away. So we had a year to redshirt him, build him up, and a lot of colleges regretted that decision to not really go after him as aggressively as I did. So you have to kind of, some of that just takes time. And again, this is where the mentorship of some great college coaches and talking around tables and stuff when nobody's around, and picking their brains and all of that. So where a kid's at in high school, you can get some indications. Did he change all 4 years in high school? In other words, was he at 103, and then was he up to 112? And the weight classes are always changing, so you know, over the years you could use you know, different weights. But if you see a kid getting bigger every year, then you can kind of project ahead he's going to be bigger. So now, here's the tricky part. You've got to figure out, in college you've got 10 weights, okay? So you've got to be looking ahead. Who's the junior? Who's the senior? Who do we need to start looking to replace? Does this kid fit that potentially? Mm-hmm. Even though he's lighter than that now, if we redshirted him a year, or even if you didn't redshirt him a year, could we fit him into the lineup, you know, with the senior leaving and so on? And that's a strategy, and that's a, again, coaches sit around tables the way you and I are, okay? Yeah. And I have an excellent coaching staff in associate head coach John Hange, Nick Bedleon, who was an All-American for me, John, and Nick Bedleon, who's a two-time All-American for Kent State, and then Jason Nace, who was also an All-American for me. So we'll sit around and we'll strategize years ahead. And we've got our eye on kids. So weight classes are really important, and that's the part you got to figure out. It's tough to pass up a good kid, but if you really don't need them that year, but you need another kid, then you got to go in that direction.
Now you said 77 schools at the Division I level. Is there wrestling at Division II and Division III level?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Division III being the largest number of schools. I don't have those off the top of my head, but yeah, you have Division II, so you do, and the difference, I say the difference, let me explain. Division II can also give scholarship money. Division III technically can't, but their financial aid packages are somehow very strong, so they find ways around that if they really want someone as well. So what I'm saying to any young person who's a student wrestler, it can pay off at any one of those divisions, Division I, Division II, Division III. Work hard in the classroom and get really good at wrestling, and people will look at you and they're going to help you in ways that they can.
Now, do you find a lot of football players that go into wrestling?
Not as much. Years ago, and if you reflect back to your time as well, you saw a lot of multi-sport athletes. I was a multi-sport athlete, as was most people at that time. Today, wrestling has gotten so good. Every sport has gotten so good that, and kids are looking to try and get scholarships. So they've really been geared in a direction not to go, through both. Now, you mentioned football. I think this is the toughest decision. The football players deciding, okay, in one scenario, you've got kids that are not big enough really to play football in Division I, for the most part. There's exceptions. And then you've got the really big kids who they have a much better chance at a scholarship with 95 scholarships. They got a much better chance to pursue football, so you don't see that crossover as much as you used to.
Right, okay. So now, what type of things do a wrestler in high school need to have? Like, is there camps or extra teams that they play on? They're not just doing high school wrestling and that's it. Is there other outside activities that these kids have to do?
Most of the good wrestlers are going to go to good camps where they get challenged and they get taught by, some excellent coaches. In addition to that, the thing that you're seeing more and more, and you probably see it more in New Jersey than most places, although Pennsylvania and other states certainly are doing it now, and that's more clubs, because high school kids can't start until a certain time. So there's a lot of clubs that fill in that gap at the beginning of their season, before their beginning of their season, and at the end of their season, and there are also clubs that run during their season that they go to after their high school workout. And every scenario is different. Sometimes people want to get that extra because they've got an opportunity to train with a certain individual or whatever.
So now the student athlete comes to Rider University. What's the process of that student athlete when they get there? When do you start your practices? When does it end? When does wrestling begin? When does that end? Or is it an all year round thing where you're taking these kids 12 months and...
It's pretty much year round now. The NCAA has guidelines. You're in the preseason, 8 hours of work, and much of that is more of a training session, cardiovascular, weightlifting, running, really building your conditioning to a certain level so that when you do get to the wrestling part of it, you have built that, because there's really no condition that can simulate wrestling. Wrestling is the ultimate condition. But you do have to build a base during that. So all Division I teams are doing the same type of thing. In the postseason, you're looking at more in a freestyle mode, which is what is wrestled, one of the two styles wrestled in the Olympics. And then in the summer, a lot of kids stay up and, Some are in summer school, some are, working in the area and come in the room and roll around. You can have an Olympic training center like Princeton has one here, where recruits can become part of that club, and then they can, come into that as well, and so on. So.
And what happens during the season? How are the practices run? Is it something where you're giving them tutors to stay on top of classes? Is it just all about wrestling and that's it? Because there's a lot of parents out there that think it's just about the sport and not so much about the graduating.
You can't do one without the other one. It's that simple. So if you are not eligible, you can't wrestle. And I tend to be a simple man in that manner to explain it to them. Doesn't matter how good you are. If you're sitting in the stands because you're not eligible, then you're not helping your team. You're not helping yourself. So your academics come first. Wrestling is extremely close second, and sometimes it's hard to see that difference. But academics, I'm speaking for Rider University, and we have an academic advisor who would back this up. If there's ever a conflict, academics wins. Okay, it's just that simple with me. That does not mean that if you have to miss a practice because academics won, that you're not going to make that up, but we'll work that out on an individual basis. And sometimes you run into that more with science majors because their labs happen at certain times of the day and so on. And there's really no way around it, so we'll do a lot more individual setup. But it's stressed hard in every Division I school. Academics are really important, and they're important to the coaches because if they're not eligible, they can't help the wrestling program.
Yeah. So now during the season, so what's the season like? How many matches are there?
16 dates. It could be a lot more matches than that because you can go to multiple, like we'll go to the Virginia Duels. And you'll have 16 teams there, and you may, depending on how you do, because it's a bracketed situation, you may wrestle 4 or 5 times down there, even though it's 2 dates, you may get in 4 or 5,
And do you continue
matches
with them when they get to the national level? After, I'm assuming nationals is after the season is pretty much done, right?
Nationals is at the tail end of the season, but is part of the season. Some people would say it's postseason. I understand the terminology, but it's just a continuation. You're going through your conference to find out if you're qualified to go to nationals. If you qualify for nationals or you get selected as a wild card, then you go on to nationals. I would like to go back to one statement concerning the academics, because the other thing, and this is really important for wrestlers to understand. There's not a whole lot of opportunity in the sport of wrestling following college. So the other thing that is stressed a lot is you've got to get this right. You've got 5 years to complete 4 years of eligibility. In that 5 years, you also need to complete your degree, and that at Rider, that's stressed a lot, and I have a very strong record. Most people that come to Rider finish and graduate from Rider.
That's fantastic.
And that's because that's your job as a college coach. You're trying to get them a college degree so that they can move on with their life beyond wrestling, because most of them won't be in wrestling after that. Some will go into coaching, some will go into MMA, which is kind of a part of it.
Right.
But for the most part, their college degree is what's going to be worth it for the rest of their life, that they wrestled, and that provided an opportunity for them to get their degree.
It's the work ethic that you give them.
Yes.
Right? Absolutely.
Work ethic academically and wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely.
One without the other.
So the nationals is pretty much part of that 16
No,
date
you
group,
have
or is it
16
added?
dates prior to that. The conference is technically postseason, doesn't count in those 16 dates, and that's usually some conferences are set up one day, some are set up on 2 days, and through the process you have 10 weight classes in college. You have 33 wrestlers that have qualified through varying processes and conferences and so on throughout the nation in each weight class. If you are in the top 8, if you finish in the top 8, you're a Division I All-American.
Wow.
All of the other people are not, okay? So out of your 33, even making the top 8 is extremely difficult at the highest level of Division I wrestling.
Fantastic. Well, we're coming to the end of our show.
Yeah.
So usually what I say to my guests is, what kind of advice do you want to give the parents out there that their sons are looking into wrestling at the college level? What kind of advice do you want to give them?
Pay strong attention to their academics. And I can't say this enough because there are all different levels. A kid can be really good, but he might not be great, okay? And that's called reality, all right? But in that process, if he's doing really, let me back that up. He's good, he's not great. He's entering college, but he has a fantastic work ethic, okay? He could get great on his work ethic, and that's what a lot of coaches look for, is that kid that's just losing to that very top kid by 1 or 2 points, and you're seeing all kinds of potential. And yeah, he's not there right now, but some kids develop a little bit later, and you think he can develop. But now in this scenario, what I'm telling him about the academics for, they can also get academic scholarship money if he's a good student. And that pays dividends. That's money you don't have to pay back. It's an athletic scholarship, and it doesn't count against the program if it's at a certain level, certain criteria. So I would strongly recommend, you know, any parent with a son that's a daughter that is a wrestler to pay close attention starting the 9th grade, because the academic requirements for the NCAA keep moving more and more stringent too. You have to have more academic units even in the last 5 years than you had to have 5 years ago. So get together with your guidance counselor. Sit down with them, map out a strategy, make sure that you're getting the number of units that you need to meet the clearinghouse. Then SATs start to become important, because the combination of grades, you have to have enough units, then you have to have good grades, then you have to match that with your SATs. If you're getting all of those, if that starts in the 9th grade, the student athlete kind of gets in that gear. If you're trying to make that up by the junior, senior year, it gets harder to do. You know, so that's the advice I would give them.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming to the show.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, no problem. So you've been watching The Secrets of College Planning. I'm your host, Anthony Uva. Until next time.